In any and all practices, you're never going to get your final product or end goal 100% to your liking the first time around. Just look at humans. Took a few million tries to get them right. Or at least headed in that direction. The byproducts of this process include several half-working cousins known as prototypes. This can be physical as well as intellectual. I can develop prototypes of a game or song as well as my chili recipe, some being indistinguishable from the release product, while others looking as if they were made using a completely different playbook. If you've ever experienced the plot of Sonic Adventure 2, you'll know what I'm talking about.
Get out, you ugly prototype!
Anything that we hold or makes contact with our skin seems to be pretty tricky to get right and thus requires a lot of testing and prototyping. Remember when cell phones didn't all look the same? Remember the Palm Pre and Microsoft Kin? These devices had countless prototypes and millions of dollars injected into them by big daddy companies like Microsoft and Palm, which was later acquired by HP. These companies are aware that people are very quick to judge a product by how it feels in the hand. This is no different with video game controllers. While I'm not carrying around a GameCube controller and using it as much in my day-to-day life as I would my smartphone, nothing against Smash players, it's still a device that needs to be durable, functional, and comfortable enough to use for hours at a time. It also needs to be quiet. Trust me, you won't appreciate a quiet controller until you've used a loud one like Google's Stadia controller. RIP. At the end of the day, this is what you'll be rubbing your greasy hands all over for years to come. I thought it'd be fun to take a look at Sony's PlayStation controller prototypes today, and possibly others in the future. Please let me know in the comments if you want that. Not only does it need to work, last long, and be comfortable in the hand, the controller needs to be marketed well and complement the design of the console it's being shipped with. And while the majority of hardware manufacturers no doubt have a line of prototyped boxes and controllers for each and every one of their properties, I'll likely mention a prototype PlayStation box here and there because, like I said, the design of one may have some influence on the other. Another caveat, this video won't be a comprehensive list due to the sheer amount of prototypes and lack of information, as this is unreleased stuff. It's not Sony's intention to show their entire hand. They might draw ideas from unseen prototypes in their future projects.
As an industry, we are most powerful when we come together.
Starting from the beginning, we have to go back. Before the beginning, to before Sony was even thinking about having a box to call their own. It was around 1988 that Miyamoto and the fellas at Nintendo approached Sony and proposed a CD add-on for the Super Nintendo. At the time, Ken Kutaragi at Sony had already designed the SNES sound chip, so making that relationship a little bit more fruitful seemed like a no-brainer on both sides. Obviously, this never came to fruition as Nintendo started to get cold feet about working with Sony. As the story goes, Nintendo thought Sony was going to use them as a stepping stone to leapfrog their way into the games business and ultimately become a rival. To Sony's embarrassment, Nintendo announced they would be working with Sony's rival Philips on this project instead. And to rub salt into the wound, Nintendo announced this betrayal the very next day after Sony had publicly said they were working with Nintendo on this add-on. Nothing came out of this directly because Nintendo ended up dropping Philips and just scrapping the whole CD add-on project, but this did cause a miasma of downstream effects, leading to Sony kicking it on their own, and to Nintendo's detriment, solidifying a very serious hold on the market share all the way up to present day. It also led to the Philips CDI.
I wonder what's for dinner.
Oh boy! I'm so hungry, I could eat an Octorok!
My boy.
While a contractual deal was never agreed upon between Sony and Nintendo, the CD add-on device, dubbed the Super Nintendo CD-ROM, made it pretty far into conceptualization, so much so that a working prototype was made in the form of a standalone console nicknamed the Nintendo PlayStation. This was essentially just a Super Nintendo with the Sony CD add-on already baked in, quite similar to the Sega CDX and JVC Wonder Mega, both of which I talk about in my Sega backwards compatibility video. A keen eye can spot a new controller alongside the collaboration hardware, taking the title of being the first Sony-branded prototype controller to use the PlayStation name. It is just a Super Nintendo controller with the words Sony PlayStation on it, but nonetheless, it was the first. After the add-on deal with Nintendo had been abandoned, Sony had already gotten its feet wet and decided to fully jump in the proverbial pool of game consoles with the PlayStation. The final design of the controller definitely shows inspiration from the Super Nintendo controller, keeping the same cross layout of the face buttons and ramping things up a little bit with handles and adding an additional set of bumpers in the form of L2 and R2. As you can probably guess, there was some experimentation in between the Super Nintendo PlayStation controller and what we would ultimately end up with. So before we go through the list of prototype controllers up to the PS5, I want to make a quick disclaimer. Information on some controllers will be more sparse than others. Some only ever existed as a single picture in a magazine, others have made their way out into the wild and ended up in consumers' hands. So the information we have is going to vary controller to controller. Also, we'll be sticking with only Sony OEM prototype controllers. No third-party or artist renditions. Just to have a little bit of fun, I'll also be ranking these on a totally subjective 1 to 3 scale based on how much I think I would enjoy using each prototype controller. 3 Crash Bandicoot heads is 2 big thumbs up. A contender, I think, to exist at your local Best Buy for pickup. 2 Crash Bandicoot heads means I see the controller put forth some interesting ideas, although I have a hard time seeing it be used in a practical setting effectively. And a 1 out of 3 heads indicating that it's just a mess in a practical sense, functional sense, and aesthetic sense. The fact that I can't actually hold any of these controllers and only can see a few pictures of them means I'll be using my imagination to fill in a lot of the blanks, and these rankings are next to meaningless, but I think it'll still be a good time. So let's start with the DTL H500C for the original PlayStation. The Undertale Heart controller, which also kind of looks like an upside down Sega Genesis controller. The D-pad and the 6-button layout with the plus and minus buttons, combined with the fact that everything else of the controller screams SNES, really makes this a mishmash of both. 2 out of 3 crash heads, because it looks like you need to be double jointed to reach that minus button. It's interesting to note that this controller, as well as several other PS1 prototype controllers, used a DE9 port. This port was very popular, being used in a lot of Atari and Sega consoles back in the day. You can see the port being used on this very early PlayStation 1 dev kit. It is funny Sony ultimately settled on a proprietary port that looks very similar to the SNES. The next few controllers, I could not find an associated serial number, so we'll just have to make up our own names. Here we've got the PSP nub controller. It's actually unknown if this is one big button or some kind of right analog stick. I lean button, but I find the placement of a button that big really odd. 1 1/2 heads out of 3. Oh god, what is that? This one keeps the Genesis style of D-pad we've been seeing, but goes for a really jarring face button layout. It looks like the Firefly symbol from The Last of Us, which is what it shall now be known as. It doesn't look like it would be too bad in practicality. Also, I can't see if the bumpers are complete on this controller or not. 1.5 out of 3. Here's another one containing a 6-button layout. Similar to the Firefly controller, this one has protruding handles as well. These are a bit longer, and most notably, the D-pad now has skateboard ramps on it. I'm giving this one a 2 out of 3 because I think the handles will help reach those bottom 2 face buttons, and while the D-pad is ugly, it's probably harmless in practicality. Moving on to the PS2, we only have one prototype controller to go over, highlighted in this tweet from official dev Jeff. At first glance, apart from the Sony logo at the top, it just looks like a third-party Mad Catz or other brand controller you'd find at GameStop. That starts to make a lot of sense as we read on in the tweet. According to Jeff, Sony decided to sell design concepts from this controller, even though it was just a prop made for prototype purposes, to third parties. It's not too big of a surprise that we don't have a ton of PlayStation 2 prototype controllers. The PlayStation 1 had 3 OEM controllers released throughout its lifespan. It's likely that Sony wasn't looking to undergo any major changes for what would be the DualShock 2 after the rapid evolution of the PlayStation 1 controller. Also, that Mad Catz PS2 controller gets 2 crash heads. The PS3 controller we're going to start with is the infamous Boomerang controller. Unlike every other controller on this list, it was shown to the public alongside a shiny metallic silver PS3, the controller's color scheme to match. I remember the slow drip feed of PS3 info back in the early 2000s. I remember just seeing a screenshot of this controller and took it at face value, like damn, we actually made it to the future. Sony could do no wrong in my eyes. Looking back, it was definitely too much style over substance. I mean, there's barely any face for the buttons to sit on, not to mention those bike handles you got at the bottom there. Maybe they legitimately help with weight distribution, but this still looks like a nightmare to store compared to a more contemporary controller. And I have to admit, it doesn't look bad on stage next to a suited up Japanese man circa 2005, but let me tell you, this is not gonna look good when you pull it out of a plastic bin in your garage 10 years later. Despite all of that, I still love this thing. 3 crash heads, I'd buy it in a heartbeat. No combination of words had me more excited in 2005 than PlayStation 3. So this is definitely unfulfilled nostalgia and hype coming back right now because I ended up buying an Xbox 360 because I played Halo at my friend's house. We have 2 more notable prototype controllers to round out the PlayStation 3. Once again, thanks to developer Jeff for putting this information on his WordPress site. Here we have the Kata Beta 2, which looks like a traditional 6-axis or DualShock 3 controller with some slight differences. You'll notice the PlayStation button lacks the logo and is just a clear pearl color. There's actually a red glowing LED that would activate when it was powered on. Not only would this show up in further prototypes, but even some official advertising from Sony. It's unknown if this was connected to some sort of feature or just used for testing purposes. We may never know. Back to the Kata Beta 2, we can see some more visual differences on the side with the shoulder buttons. The player LEDs are arranged in a square, and they have this clear plastic shield in front of them. Additionally, L2 and R2 are not triggers, they are analog buttons like they were on the DualShock 2. The biggest change to the interior is the inclusion of rumble motors. As you may know, the PS3 6-axis controller was not initially shipped with rumble functionality. Sony claimed that it interfered with the gyroscope and all the motion stuff. That very same year, Sony had just so happened to be in a legal battle against a company named Immersion over a patent of theirs they had infringed upon. The patent having to do with vibration functions in game controllers.
Ironic.
Long story short, Sony appealed and lost, but were able to work something out with Immersion later, hence the existence of the DualShock 3. Funny enough, Microsoft had actually infringed on the same patent and were sued as well, but they just settled out of court. 3 crash heads for this one, guys. I mean, it's just a DualShock 3 with some extra lights. That goes for the very similar Seabed 1010 variant as well. The last PS3 prototype controller will be covering the Alps MSU Rev 3 M3, or as I like to call it, the forehead. I mean, look at this thing. Who knows what it's hiding? Additional space for a larger battery? More vibration motors? A string to reveal some embarrassing snapshots from the Christmas party? While there likely is something behind the extra cargo space, this seems to be a downgrade in terms of style from the DualShock controllers that came before. There's no home button, instead we have the analog switch from the DualShock 2, and like the previous one we looked at, we have buttons for L2 and R2 instead of triggers. At the end of the day, it seems to be a wireless DualShock 2 with a bald spot. 2 out of 3 crashes, it loses the half just for how ridiculous it looks. Next up, my personal favorite, the DualShock 4. The 4th DualShock felt like a fantastic improvement from the previous DualShock design we had. Finally, we got some decent triggers, a well-needed upgrade from what was going on with the DualShock 3. It was lightweight, and my biggest pet peeve, you could now move the sticks towards each other without your thumbs kissing. We have quite a lot of DualShock 4 prototypes to go over, thanks to an image revealed during Sony's 2019 GDC presentation. The one we have the most information over is the JDX 1000. This controller was shipped with a lot of PS4 dev kits. I think the controller looks pretty nice. You've got the PlayStation Vita's D-pad and a less pronounced touchpad. The shell is a little generic looking and it doesn't look nearly as comfortable as the final product, but you also have to keep in mind these aren't promotional images. These are just pictures from people who got their hands on them. 2.5 out of 3 crash heads. I really like it, but it just seems like a bare bones DualShock 4. Going back to the GDC picture, we can see a lot that are slight variations of the JDX1K, and others that have so much going on I don't even know where to start. Let's take a look at two more and look at them simultaneously. If I were to assume, I would say these two represent a fork in the path to what could have been the DualShock 4. One path taking influence from the Wii U and the other the Xbox 360. The DualShock U we have here obviously takes a lot of inspiration from the Wii U gamepad. We can see the same analog face button and D-pad placement, as well as a screen in the middle, taking up most of the controller. I suppose we don't know definitively if that is a screen or not. They might have just been toying around on where to put the touchpad. Also, you gotta have them bike handles. What's a PlayStation controller without them? 2 out of 3 crash heads, just because it would be really interesting to see Sony take this Nintendo-inspired direction. Apart from that, the controller looks very uncomfortable and ugly as sin. The DualShock 360, on the other hand, I think looks pretty slick. The left analog stick placement resembles what the Xbox has been doing, while the right analog stick placement pulls a Wii U. So I suppose this more closely resembles a Wii U Pro controller than an Xbox controller, but that dichotomy doesn't work as well. I've always preferred PlayStation's analog placement at the bottom, but throughout the years I've found it's pretty easy to train your brain to use all of the placements. 2.5 crashes, I think some people might actually prefer this option. Kinda makes you wonder if we'll ever see an OEM controller where you can swap out modules containing the analog sticks and face buttons to rearrange them. We've reached modern day, the current end of DualShock and beginning of the PS5's DualSense controller. We have some information over one confirmed prototype, but before we get to it, just for fun, I wanted to throw in some images of this fake one. Images with this controller began circulating leading up to the PS5's unveiling. A Kotaku employee, Jason Schreier, was able to confirm later that the controller depicted was not an official one from Sony. Being that we have a lot of photos of it, it's likely not a render, but nonetheless a really good fake. Reset Era forum goers noticed the circle button depicted is a bit too large, and I mean, come on, that D-pad is atrocious. I know it doesn't really count, but 1.5 heads out of 3. Photos of the official DualSense prototype that we have were taken by, once again, official dev Jeff. This man carries the entire PlayStation prototype community on his back. The design of this prototype was confirmed to match some patents filed by Sony. It looks like the finalized DualSense controller without any influence from the PS5 console. If I were to guess, I'd say this was a prototype controller far into development and was only updated once the console design was finalized. You can see how it inherits a lot from the DualShock 4, like the options button, share button. The touchpad isn't a trapezoid like we would get in the final version. And as a DualShock 4 fan, I gotta be honest, I love this design. Obviously, it doesn't mesh well with the current design language. Again, just personal preference, but like the DualShock 4, it looks a little more orderly. There's more plateaus and hard lines where you can rest your thumbs. The single LED at the top, I think, also just looks so much cleaner. Easiest 3 Crash Bandicoot heads of my life. So that's it. That wraps up this quick look at the PlayStation prototype controllers we've seen throughout the years. I know there's a ton more out there, some I decided not to cover because it was just too similar to what we were already looking at, and I'm sure there's prototypes we'll never see, only a select few in Sony ever will. Although, as time goes by, information usually makes its way to the masses with these sorts of things. I'm someone who finds controller unveilings just as exciting as console unveilings, especially nowadays where the amount of time between console releases has lengthened, and specifically with PlayStation, we usually get to see at least one new piece of functionality. Whether or not they've all been successful and/or been retained for future revisions is another story. Hey, this is Shanmania. Really appreciate you watching. This was fun to make. Been loving what's going on with the YouTube channel, in the Discord, hearing from you guys, getting suggestions from you guys. It's been awesome. So just wanted to say, please hit all the buttons, like and subscribe, all that business. Leave a comment, it helps the algorithm. And I'll see you next time. Please tip your servers and have a good night.